Welcome. Lovely to have you here with us this evening as we gather once again. Céad míle fáilte to those of you who have never joined us here in the diocese for a webinar. Lovely to have you with us, particularly as over the coming weeks, we're really celebrating being together again. This series of webinars is called Finding Hope as we Reconnect. And tonight we will begin with the theme of grief and bereavement. And I look forward with you to listening to Dr. Finola Cunnane explore with us how we might live with this reality. November can be a challenging time for any one of us, especially if you're newly bereaved. It's a time when, as a faith community, we remember our dead. We remember our beloved who've gone before us to God. We remember them, we pray for them, we ask them to continue to walk with us in our journey in life. In a particular way, we're very conscious of those who are newly bereaved, those who are feeling the loss and the sadness of their loved one at this time. This may be because the person has died very recently, or it could be a number of months or years ago, but yet the grief lives on. So tonight we gather as a community to be with one another as we listen and as we ponder how we might live with the gift or the curse of grief and bereavement. If you would like to ask a question at any stage, in the middle of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. So during Finola speaking to us, you can put in a question at any stage and I'll collect those questions and I'll ask them at a later stage in the proceedings. Would that be okay? In terms of introducing you to Finola, Dr. Finola Cunnane, firstly, you're very welcome. You might be known to some people here in the diocese as a Louis sister. Through your work in retreat work, your work as a spiritual director. You may be known to others, those who've been RE teachers or chaplains through your work with Mater Dei Institute. Your name might be familiar to many from the Intercom, where you have written beautiful pieces on prayer and reflections, enabling us really to pray and to enter into the different seasons in the liturgical year. You also have a background in education, in scripture, in spirituality. You worked both here and in the States and elsewhere. So you come to us tonight, and thank you for coming, with a huge richness of experience and understanding of how we might live with grief and bereavement. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Frances. And good evening, everybody. I am delighted to be with you here this evening. And we're talking about a topic that is so familiar to each one of us and that is so painful for each one of us. And each time and every time we encounter a grief, a loss, a bereavement, all kinds of stuff is churned up within us. So what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation with you, and I'm going to talk us through this, and as a way of addressing some of what surfaces for us in grief and to help us understand why we feel the way we feel and how. And grief is so difficult for each one of us, and sometimes we try to run away from it. And how can we stay with it in order to come out the other end? So let me just begin sharing the screen. Apologies for that walk through the slides so quickly. So we're talking about living with grief and loss. I'm very conscious that loss and grief is very much part of our human journey and how we experience it over and over again. And yet each time we experience it, it is different. I'm also very conscious that we have natural losses along the way. For example, the loss of birth. And by that, I mean the loss of being in the womb space into our world. That's a loss. And then as we grow through infancy and into toddler, at that stage. There's the loss of babyhood. And then, the loss of toddlerhood, if you want to call it that, as we enter childhood, and the loss of childhood as we enter adolescence, and so on along the way. So we have natural losses that we encounter. And then we have very particular experience of loss and grief. And we all respond very differently to loss and grief. And we all respond very differently to each individual loss and how we respond to that. And, if I'm to look back on my life and at the various losses that I have encountered and in accompanying others through their losses, these are some of how we might feel when a loss knocks at our door. And so, for example, there's the shock. Whether we were expecting that loss or not, it's still a shock. And then there's the disbelief. Has it really happened? Did it happen? And, I remember the morning my father died, and my mother, we all came home from the hospital, and my mother standing at the kitchen sink and saying over and over again, imagine I'm a widow. Imagine I'm a widow. And when I played that back to her some years later, she had no memory of it whatsoever. So it was the utter disbelief of what had just happened. And then we replay the scenario. We replay if we were present at the death, the last moments, or replaying how we heard the news, where we were, the phone call, who called us out, who told us, and the replaying of that, again, as if in disbelief. And then sometimes we have that separation of ourselves from what has just happened, from what we have just heard. And sometimes, again, I remembered my father's funeral. Yes, I was very aware it was my father's funeral, but it just seemed like I wasn't feeling any of it. It just felt like I was going through the motions. And so there was that separation going on at his funeral and what had happened over the last few days. And then we find ourselves asking the question, is it really true? Did I really hear that correctly? And I remember this being very true for me recently when I heard news I really didn't want to hear. And, waking up and saying, did it really happen? Is it really true? Is it really going to happen, whatever I was being told? And so we question and we wonder. And it's nearly as if life has stopped for us. And again, I've had this experience over several bereavements, very conscious how life has stopped for me. But when I look around, life is continuing for other people. They're continuing to live their lives. And my life has been turned upside down. And so there's that overwhelming sense of loss. There's an overwhelming sense of sadness. There's that aching loneliness. And there's immense pain. A pain that just consumes us and just overtakes us. And some of our responses to loss, over the ensuing weeks, very, very difficult to concentrate, very difficult to pay attention, and very difficult to hear what people are saying to us at times. And I remember, again, two instances around that when my father died. I remember somebody saying to me, she was telling me something, and I asked her to repeat it. And she said to me quite snappily, she said, Finola, you're not listening or not hearing very well at the moment. And, it was only in hindsight, I thought, how could I hear? And another instance was about 2 months after my father died and being offered a particular position. And at the end of the conversation, I said to the person, I said, I know you're speaking English, but I said, I can't hear you. I couldn't get it. And it was just that inability to hear, to listen, to concentrate. And there's that inability to function, and to function as you did before the loss. And so, how do we mind ourselves in that? How do we have patience with ourselves in that? How do we accept ourselves in that? All that is so difficult. And there's also an awareness that, you know, you may have great family members and great friends, and they can accompany you and be with you, but they can only go so far with you on your journey through grief. The rest you have to do alone. And that's a very lonely place. There's only so far that people can accompany you on that space. And another response to loss that I've come across quite a lot is what I call the clashing of griefs. That within a family setting, for example, or if it's a wider setting, there can be fractions, there can be divisions, there can be sparring of each other. And it comes out as a lack of understanding, or accusations here and there, or misunderstandings. But it's the clashing of griefs, because each person is grieving in his or her own way. And so we just encounter that. And that's not a nice space either. And it just feels like everything is at loggerheads. And then within our own beings, we have our physical responses. And, you know, so they're the responses that manifest themselves physically. Maybe it's around eating. I either lose my appetite or I comfort eat. Maybe it's around trying to dull the pain. Maybe it's through alcohol, through drugs. Maybe it's sleeplessness or wanting to sleep all the time. And very often it's a physical illness, that the grief is so immense and our bodies, our physical selves have been so affected that we become ill ourselves. And whether that's, you know, a temporary illness, just an off-color illness, or something more serious. And we have our emotional responses. And there, the emotional responses are the responses that the world is most familiar with. And it's, you know, and the world allows us to grieve. But sometimes it's nearly like the world only allows us to grieve so much. And then they want us to get over it and pull up our socks or whatever. But we have all kinds of emotional responses, and they can happen to us and take us unawares. So I might hear a piece of music, and suddenly I'm in floods of tears. Or maybe I smell a smell or pass a restaurant, any memory that I've shared with another. Or maybe it is, and this is something that happened to me recently, and I was quite taken aback by it. So I'm in the bank, and my mother and I used to have a joint bank account, and they wanted me to bring my mother in with her ID and everything. And I said, I can't. And they said, why? And I said, because she's dead. And I got upset. And I thought, oh, wow, you never know when something like this is going to happen to you. And then we have our social responses. And, you know, whether it is I want to be with people, I don't want to be with people, I want to withdraw. And there are many social responses that just come to visit us. And then we have those deeper questions. What's life all about? And, you know, they're connected with the spiritual questions. Where is my beloved now? Where is the one I have lost right now? Where are they? And so we begin to ask those deeper life questions. And we just mull over them, or maybe they lead somewhere, but they're there. And, is there a God? Is there a heaven? Is there life after death? Whatever it is, they begin to make their presence felt within us as well. So there's some of the reactions and responses when we're going through and experiencing a loss in the early days and not so early days. But one of the things I really would love to distinguish for us this evening is the difference, the distinction between loss, bereavement, and grief. And that loss is its own separate entity. When we lose someone or something, it's a very definite experience. And grief is our response to that loss. Grief is our reaction to that loss. And that's why grief is different for everybody. And that's why each loss we experience, the grief is different because the loss is different. And while most of us associate loss and grief with death, we also have to bear in mind that there are other kinds of losses and types of losses that we encounter throughout our lives, or that others encounter throughout their lives. For example, you've got the loss of miscarriage. You've got the loss of a job, the loss of a house, a home, the loss of a relationship, the loss of good health. And there are many other losses. And really, loss is about the loss of anything we value. I meant to put in there too, the loss of a pet, because that can be very big for people. And so we've touched on now that grief has many dimensions, and the emotional is the one that maybe is focused on most. And we also have those other dimensions that I outlined in the previous slide, the physical dimensions, behavioral dimensions, social dimensions, spiritual dimensions, philosophical dimensions, and there are cultural dimensions to grief. And, like our Celtic ancestors had their own relationship with death and their cultural response to death. And the modern world today, sometimes we're inclined to gloss over it a little bit. And, we're moving now from using the word death to passed on or has passed or whatever. And just interesting to notice the language that we're using around what is happening and what has happened. And I would love to emphasize this evening too, that no two people experience grief in the same way. And I remember that being said to us when my dad died, the priest coming to the house and saying, what did he say? Each of you has lost a different father. And how right was he? Because each of us had a different relationship with our father, given where we were placed in the family, etc. And so no two people experience the grief of the same person, the person that they're grieving in the same way, because everybody has a different relationship with that person. And so when we're going through the experience of loss, there's a pattern, if you want to put it that way. And the pattern is, and it's a journey. It's the event itself, that's the actual loss. And then there's the during period. Now, that's the longest part of it and the most painful part of it, and the part that we try to escape, but it's the most important part. And if we can really stay with the during period, we will come out the other end and we will experience the integration period, which is living what people may call a new normal. It's living with the loss, but being able to function as normally as possible. So this during period, I'd like to just spend a little time with that. There is no doubt it is the most difficult. And there is no doubt that we want to run away from it or we want to rush through it because it's very painful to be in an in-between space, a space where it's not the space before the loss, and it's certainly not the space where I can live with the loss. It's that awful space where I'm struggling and I'm grappling and I have my good days and my bad days. Well, and it's the most horrible space. And it's the space where I dread, say, Christmas, or dread the birthday that's coming up, or dread the family gathering for whatever. It's just the most horrible space. And I know each one of you know what I'm talking about here. And, you know, the experts, the psychologists, they tell us that the real benefit is staying with this during period. And deep in our hearts, we know that's true. We know it's true. But it is so difficult. And maybe we need a compliment on that journey, somebody to hold our hands a little bit, and somebody that we know is there for us, particularly during this period. There's an invitation in this during period, and the invitation is to let grief manage us rather than our trying to manage the grief. If we could let grief take us by the hand, and rather than our trying to manage it and say, get behind me, Satan, or trying to lock it into a cupboard, or trying to dull it with whatever and numb it with whatever. And there's a saying in a book written by Francis Bauer, and he says, the point of the journey is the quality of the traveling. And in other words, for a lot of our lives, we try to rush from A to C, and we don't appreciate the time that B has to offer. So it's about the quality of the traveling. What do I encounter along the way? Who do I encounter along the way? And then I came across this lovely quote by Vicky Harrison, and she writes, grief is like the ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm, sometimes it's overwhelming. And all we can do is learn to swim. And that's what this during period is like. It's about learning to swim. There's a woman called Martina Gargan, and she wrote a lovely poetry book called Under Connemara Skies. And her only child was killed in a car accident in 2011. And she, as one of her ways of coping, she began to write poetry. And I borrowed from her for this because it's talking about this during space. And she calls it A Way Through. And she says, is it getting any easier? They ask earnestly. Wait till the year is out and the anniversary is over, they say wisely, as if there is a way out. For there is no escaping the pain and sorrow which envelops and almost smothers you. There is only a way through as you become accustomed to the aching loneliness until it becomes an integral part of you. Just a beautiful way that she has captured this during space. Another very important point that I want to make this evening is that in order to really understand loss and grief, we need to understand attachment. Because without attachment, there would be no loss and there would be no grief. And, you know, from our earliest days on this earth, we have formed attachment with significant others. And this is normal for children and for adults. And so we make strong bonds. We make strong affectional bonds with others. And therefore, we have a very strong reaction when those bonds are threatened or broken. And it doesn't, again, just to reiterate, it doesn't have to be with other people. It can be a job, it can be a home, it can be a pet. All of these, we make strong affectional bonds. And I often find, if I have a strong affectional bond with somebody and we have a misunderstanding, we have a row, that's a horrible space to be in. And, it's interesting to notice how we feel when we're faced with a row or a misunderstanding, which hopefully can be healed. And that's even magnified more with the death of a loved one. And there's a psychiatrist called George Engel, and his thesis is that the loss of a loved one is as psychologically traumatic as the physiological trauma of being severely injured or burnt or recovering from surgery. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, because with the physiological trauma, we might be able to see with our own eyes, see the physiological trauma. But the psychological trauma of loss and grief is as painful and needs to be honored in the same way. So healing is exceedingly necessary for both traumas. And just, remembering your times of grief. What are they? What they do to us is we depart from our state of health and well-being. That's suddenly left behind because everything is in disarray. So just as healing is necessary in order for a person to return to full physical health, therefore, a period of healing time is also necessary for the bereaved person, for the mourner, to return to a similar state of equilibrium. And that takes a long time. And so the process of mourning, of bereavement, is similar to the process of healing. And somebody might ask, well, how long does mourning last? It's the same as asking, how long is a piece of string? There is no answer. Mourning takes its own course. Mourning is a very individual journey, and it takes time. And it takes time until that person is able to function in a way that is similar to the way they functioned before experiencing the loss. And just to quickly walk through, there are 4 tasks of mourning, and we've referred to them in previous slides. So the first task is to accept the reality of the loss. Because when somebody we love dies, we have that sense that it hasn't happened. And we may find ourselves calling out to that person. I've done that. I have called out to my dad when the house was empty, just to hear myself saying, Dad. I've called his phone, even though I know he's not going to pick up. I've done things like that. And so there are times too when you might think you see them. You see them in the street. But it's somebody who reminds us of our loved one. And we keep having to tell ourselves over and over that our loved one is no longer with us. So it takes a long time to accept the reality of a loss. And that's okay. And then our second task is to work through to the pain of grief. And again, it's aware that we experience grief in all the dimensions of our physicality. So our physical beings, our emotional beings, our social beings, our spiritual beings. And sometimes we don't want to feel the pain because it's way too much. So we distract ourselves, or we ensconce ourselves into something, or we comfort eat, comfort drink, whatever it is. Sometimes too, we want to avoid those painful thoughts of the person who has left us. Maybe a painful memory, maybe a row, maybe something the person said. And we want to avoid that because It's too painful for us to think about it. Maybe other times we nearly make saints out of them. We idolize them. I know somebody who did that, and nearly as if when her mum died, her mum could have done no wrong. Her mum was a saint. And so we tend to avoid any painful reminders of the deceased. And if we avoid too much, it's okay to avoid pain from time to time. We need to do that for our own well-being. But if we avoid the pain altogether, it can lead to depression. It can lead to a breakdown. And so the only way is to go through the pain, painful and all as it is. And our the third task of mourning, is to adjust to living without our loved one. And so when somebody that we love dies, we too are challenged. And we're challenged to face our own sense of self. So who am I now? Who am I now without this person in my life? And sometimes, initially, bereavement can lead to an intense regression. And, a regression where I see myself as a helpless human being. I'm incapable of doing this or that. I'm inadequate. I remember my mother feeling this very soon after my father died, not knowing how to pay the bills, not knowing how to do various things around the house that he always took charge of. But over time, the hope is that the bereaved person will learn new ways of living, new ways of doing things, new ways of living in the world. And so there's a sense of adjustment, and a sense of adjustment as to how I am in the world. And even though my beliefs, values, whatever may be challenged, sometimes I feel I've lost direction in life. And that's a horrible space to be in. And what do I do when I experience that? Is there someone I can talk to? Someone that will help me back to myself? And so as a bereaved person, we search and we search for meaning, and we search for direction and a new direction for my life. And this is another quotation poem from Martina Gargan that I'd like to put in, because it talks about this uncertainty. And she writes, "The old order has changed now, and gone with it are all the sureties that our safe beliefs, securities, so confidently felt. Gone is that space and time when life was kind and full of an unfettered belief in possibility. A life where nothing ever shocked or rocked its core or roots. Such a time or place no longer exists for me as I move through the day, almost invisibly. That once easy path to the future, never mapped out or pre-planned, now seems like a major highway of unfamiliar and obscure signs. A daunting and unknown journey where the only certainty is nothing can ever be the same again." And our fourth task of mourning is to go on living in the world, and go on living knowing that my loved one is no longer physically with me in this world, but I am able to go on living effectively in the world. And so just to bring it all together, in conclusion, we're talking about living with loss. We're talking about recognizing that grief is a long-term process. We're also recognizing that grieving does not follow a linear path. We have good days and bad days. It's more like a spiral. And there is a sense in which the mourning can be finished when people regain an interest in life, feel more hopeful, experience gratification again, and adapt to new roles. This is what we hope for. And there's also a sense that mourning is never finished. So it comes to an end, and yet it continues. So thank you.
Thanks, Finola. Gosh, there's just so much in that. So much that resonates with me, and I'm sure with all of those who are listening. We might just take a moment and we're going to listen to a piece of music, Chris Lum, just maybe to see what is it in all that you've heard from Finola that's really kind of triggering or resonating deep within you.
Christian, Christron, Christum jeg, Christus makjansa, agus Christ fum, Christen agani ma Christa, Christ fos oiastium, Christoi. Antinatix lianu, Antinatix lianu, Garevelanu aina, in armask gasel nasel. Christian, Christron, Christum jeg, Christus makjansa, agus Christ fum, Christen agani ma Christa, Christ fos oiastium, Christoi. Antinatix lianu, Antinatix lianu, Garevelanu aina, in armask gasel nasel, in armask gasel nasel.
And so many of the images there remind us of people we have lost and loved ones who've gone before us to God. A few questions have come in here, Finola. I'd love if you could respond to them. I suppose you mentioned your mother being aware of being a widow, and even as adults, that sensation for. I think I've been muted. I'm unmuted again. Am I? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. I missed some of it, Frances.
Sorry, pardon me. I suppose just you mentioned your mother being a widow, and I suppose that sensation for many of us of being an orphan, even though you're an adult and when you lose your parents, but that there's that sensation of just suddenly being alone.
Yes.
You've mentioned about life having stopped and that people can only travel with you so far. And one of the questions that came in was around that clashing of griefs that can happen in a family, particularly if somebody is dying, or somebody is very ill, that there can be that clashing long before the death.
Yes.
Could you talk to us a little about that?
And it's, everybody is facing the impending death in their own way. And maybe everyone has different desires or wishes. And so it can be around the deceased, but it can, or the sick person, but it can also be around each individual wants to be seen and heard and valued for who he or she is. And sometime in the clashing of griefs, it's around feeling that somebody has a stronger voice than me. And I want also to be part of that. It can also be to do with, I came across a family recently where the dad died and the eldest daughter was always known to be the favorite, you know, the firstborn and everything. But it was like her siblings took it out on her then when the father died and nearly blamed her, even though she was an innocent person in that. But again, it was clashing of griefs. And, you know, the presentation of of the clash isn't usually the real clash, if you know what I mean. There's something more going on underneath it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I suppose it's helpful too to hear that our responses can be different, because I think sometimes maybe, you know, in our desire to support someone who's grieving, maybe we try to tidy up the mess too soon.
Yes, that's right. And the mess is really important. And grief can't be rushed. And all the person who's grieving wants is to be accompanied and to be heard. And it's okay to feel however that person is feeling and not to be judged for it.
No. And you mentioned, and I thought it was really helpful to hear, because sometimes when we come to November, we're very conscious of those who've died and have gone before us, and we pray very specially for them.
Yeah.
But there are the griefs that we live with for people who are missing in our lives for different reasons. It might be alcohol or drug addiction. It might be, you know, an estrangement in a family. Lots of things. I mean, we all know different scenarios within our own families and wider circles, but, you know, how do we live with that ongoing grief that isn't death?
Yes. And that's very difficult, Frances. And it's to do with, how can I resolve or accept or forgive? Because forgiveness is a huge part here as well. Myself, for the estrangement I might have with, now maybe the person has gone off through no fault of mine, if you know what I mean. The person is no fault of mine. But how can I deal with all that I'm feeling? I suppose it's about naming the feelings first and acknowledging those feelings. But then there may be practical steps I can take. I suppose every scenario is different, so it's hard to give
Sure.
what I say, an overall answer for that, because people are missing for various reasons or separated from us for various reasons. Usually it's to do with the misunderstanding or a lack of acceptance around whatever issue. That can be a huge part of it.
But yes, and you're right. There are so many different reasons, but it was just helpful to hear you mention that there are so many griefs, because, you know, sometimes we don't acknowledge the pain and loss for people in other stages of grief or in other aspects of grief. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I'm conscious that we've been chatting for a while, and it's been really powerful to hear what you've said. And I think that will stay with people, and we will put it up on the Diocesan YouTube channel. Okay. But just, would you have a focal square, something that you'd be saying, look, hold on to this?
Yeah, I have actually, Frances. And
what great.
I have is a blessing. It's from John O'Donnell. But I'd love to pray it for all of us, all our loved ones who have gone before us, and particularly conscious of this month of November. And it's for all of us as we grieve and as we journey through our grief. And this is the blessing. Though we need to weep your loss, you dwell in that safe place in our hearts when no storm or night or pain can reach you. Your love was like the dawn, brightening over our lives, awakening beneath the dark a further adventure of colour. The sound of your voice found for us a new music that brightened everything. Let us not look for you only in memory, where we would grow lonely without you, You would want us to find you in presence, beside us when beauty brightens, when kindness glows and music echoes eternal tones. When orchids brighten the earth, dark as winter has turned to spring. May this dark grief flower with hope in every heart that loves you. May you continue to inspire us to enter each day with a generous heart, to serve the call of courage and love until we see your beautiful face again in that land where there is no more separation, where all tears will be wiped from our mind and where we will never lose you again. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you.
Finola, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming and sharing your wisdom and your reflection and the spirituality you bring to it all. And that will enrich us as we move through these days of November. To those who joined us, thank you for being with us. Mila buejas, lovely to have you. We're going to continue with our webinars. So next Thursday night, we will gather again and we will reconnect with the gift of the Eucharist. And it's Father Nicholas Flynn of the diocese who'll be exploring appreciating the Eucharist. So look forward to seeing you then, or for either of the second or the third and fourth ones after that. Come any night on a Thursday night, we'd love to have you. Take care, slán a bhaile, and until the next time.